Well, thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Kim, for the introduction, and to all the staff at the archives. I've been haunting this place for the last 3 or 4 years, and will continue to do so through the summer. But I love it here, and it's always wonderful to be in Butte and to get to speak with a community that is so enthusiastic about local history, which is just a joy. Since I'm way in the weeds on my PhD dissertation research, I'm not going to present so many conclusions today as just kind of walk you through an overview of some of my thinking about my project. And it started really focusing on Columbia Gardens, but has grown to be much more than just the story of the gardens, because I started thinking about where people went the rest of the year and why Butte has had the kinds of parks it has at certain times. So today I'm going to focus on giving you an overview of how I've divided Butte's history into sort of 3 eras since the 1890s. So first I'll talk a little bit about the Copper King era and when the copper companies were footing the bill for parks like Columbia Gardens. And then I'll look at the federal funding era, where we talk about the New Deal, Works Progress, funding for parks, as well as the Model Cities program. And then I'll end with the Superfund cleanup and historic preservation era. And Kim gave you a little bit of an introduction, but I do want to flash some of my Butte street cred. Okay.
There.
Yes. There we go. Okay.
Sorry about that. I always forget that.
So my great-great-grandfather, Owen McCabe, immigrated from Ireland to Butte in the 1890s, and he and his wife, Nora, got married in Anaconda and were living in Walkerville in 1900. But he was a miner and an organizer for labor, and I was really delighted when diving into Columbia Gardens that I found he had actually given a Labor Day speech there when he was running for leadership in the miners' union. He didn't win that election, but he did still. He was very active, and he was a member delegate to a national convention for the miners' union in Denver in 1909, I believe. But all of my great-grandparents were, great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents were in Butte or Anaconda all the way back. And I'm over here. My grandparents grew up in Anaconda, and then I had my youngest years in Poplar, Montana, and moved to Missoula, where I went to high school. So that's a little bit about how I'm connected to the area. Growing up in Montana, obviously my whole life, I spent a lot of my summers at Georgetown Lake at my great-great-uncle's cabin, Joe and Wally Volkovats, and this is the only fish I ever caught over by Denton's, very proud moment. And me with my brothers and parents at a Bobcat Grizzly game sometime in the mid-90s. My cousin played, actually I had cousins play for the Bobcats and cousins play for the Grizzlies, so we got it all covered. And so I actually did go away for school. I went to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and I'm telling you this because it explains kind of how I'm approaching my project. So when I graduated, I actually worked in the professional sports industry for a few years. I thought I was going to be like some kick-butt woman sports executive, which didn't work out, but I learned a lot on the job. So I worked for the Washington Nationals, and my major project for them was working on capital improvements to the stadium, because it's a publicly owned facility that the city funded. And one of my biggest projects that I proposed and got approved was working with our head groundskeeper on a full field drainage system replacement. This was a year-long project, basically almost $1 million. We finished it ahead of schedule and under budget, which was amazing. But going through this process taught me a lot about the relationship between a city and its entertainment businesses, I should say, as well as the roles of these spaces that are meant for the public and for public enjoyment. Of course, people work in these spaces, which is a perspective I got from being an employee in the sports industry, but also thinking about how this one stadium changed an entire neighborhood in DC and how it's connected to streets and transportation and income and jobs and any number of infrastructure problems that actually end up getting pretty messy and people care about, even though we maybe don't like to think about them. And so that finally I got to grad school and I was trying to translate what I'd learned on the job into my academic work, because I think that makes the most sense to sort of always carry your experience with you and learn from it. And my mom directed me toward Columbia Gardens because I was born in the 90s, long after it was gone. But what started to really strike me about the existence of such a beautiful place where, people are in this case, in their Sunday best to come see the Boston and Montana band, is what else was going on in the city. You know, I mean, these folks might put on their best dress, but for work they're going underground, or you know, they're walking the streets that are smoky, or they're dodging, you know, cars and trains and horses and all sorts of things. So there's a real contrast going on here between what it would be like to go somewhere like Columbia Gardens and to walk the streets of Butte on a daily basis. And then this photo has come to define a lot of how my project has developed. And so this was towards the end of Columbia Gardens when the pit was really encroaching on the site, particularly the roller coaster. And this image just strikes me so much because Columbia Gardens was supposed to be a gift to the city from the mining companies, you know, particularly from Clark, but then from the Anaconda Company. And then to see that, I mean, really at heart, the priority was always mining, you know. And that there was something really grand lost for the city and its people, not only when it came to where they could go and what they could enjoy, but when it came to the relationship with copper. So that's a very long introduction as to how I got here. Now I'll kind of dive into these sort of three eras that I mentioned. So the Copper King era, the federal program era, and the historic preservation and Superfund era. And of course, these all have a little bit of overlap. I'm not naive to that, but for the convenience of sorting our thoughts into these sort of three categories of stories, that's where I'm gonna leave. And I wanted to start with, got a little bit cut off, so I'm gonna have to run over to this side. But when I was a Carrie Johnson Fellow, I spent a lot of my time walking around the city of Butte, and I also was rereading the story of Mary McLean, and I was really struck by how she talked about the landscape and the look of Butte at the turn of the century. And so, in particular with this quote, she notes the long sandy wastes, the red line on the sky at the setting of the sun, the cold, gloomy mountains under it, the ground without a weed, without a grass blade even in their season, for they have years ago been killed off by the sulfur smoke from the smelters. And this is a very sensory excerpt. You know, we have sight with the color of the sandy waste, which even gets into texture, right, of it's grainy and it's dusty and it's dirty, and the red sky as opposed to what we might think of now as a healthy skyline that might be blue or beautiful colors that aren't coming from chemicals. And I'm of course really struck when I'm thinking about parks about the idea that there's no grass, that there's no green. And I know many of you are much more familiar with that than I am, but that just really struck me because we think of Montana now as such a beautiful place that we're so, you know, sort of enamored by. And Butte was still a beautiful place when it was a big industrial city, but it was very different than what we might think of now. And I love this map. I try to put it in every single presentation I do about Butte because I think it's awesome. But not only thinking about what's going on above ground, so what colors and textures are we getting above ground? What color is the sky? How much smoke is there? Are we, you know, moving the smelter to Anaconda so that the air isn't as smoky? But no matter what, with the city that's built upon this place we now call Butte, it is a patchwork of claims about what's going on underneath the ground. And this comes to define so much of the city. It's actually almost even a miracle that we have a sort of normal infrastructure above ground, knowing that all of this is what it was built upon. You know, I mean, streets don't happen by accident. A downtown doesn't happen by accident. These things do take some planning and they take some effort into thinking about what do people need where. And so balancing those needs of people actually really living here, and people really do live in Butte, they live hard, but also being so defined by work and attracting people to this city for work. That's a big difference that I'll touch on later when we get to the historic preservation and cleanup era. So I wanted to tie this to Columbia Gardens and note the claims that it sat upon. And we get a couple versions of the story of when Columbia Gardens started, and I did say that this presentation was starting with 1898, but never rely on a historian to actually start on the date they say they will. And so, as Pat Carney noted in his book about Columbia Gardens, the earliest that we know about someone coming here with the interest of mining, taking this land, is Walter William Adams in 1876, makes a claim in Horse Canyon and calls it Columbia. I don't know if the claim name got changed or what, because none of these claims are named Columbia in this map, which was from the Clark Realty Company in the 1920s, but regardless, it did start as a mining claim when we're thinking about the history of Butte. And because that mining claim was not profitable in the 1870s, Adams started hosting entertainment up at his land. So we don't know quite when he started calling it Columbia Gardens, but by 1884 he is advertising it in the newspaper as a place for regular amusement with dancing and picnics, occasionally some drink or some traveling entertainment. There's one ad I particularly love about a magician coming to show off his marvelous decapitation. It's quite a illustrative advertisement. But when we think about Columbia Gardens, it actually went through a number of cycles then of land use. So thinking about it as land, before American settlement, so indigenous land, and then thinking about Adams coming in, deciding that this was a claim he wanted to explore, shifting gears into entertainment, and then that it comes under the ownership of copper companies, but they keep it as an entertainment space until they decide they need it, which is part of why that image I showed of the pit encroaching on the park is so important to me. It's thinking about these cycles of land use. I was also really surprised when just going through the newspapers to find out that between the ownership of Adams and Senator Clark, there was actually a push for the city of Butte to buy Columbia Gardens and run it as its own public park. And in the 1890s, Butte doesn't really have a public park system, not unlike many children into the 1960s, kids were playing wherever they could, whether it was an empty lot or in the street, but parks weren't really coming into their own in the form of local bureaucratic government yet. And so it's really interesting that the city council decides, well, Butte's a proper city, we should have a public park. And because the streetcar company had pulled up its tracks, which of course, Clark going to the streetcar company, no one got to go up to Columbia Gardens at all in the year of 1898, excuse me. At this time, there is a lot of push and pull. The manager of the streetcar company, Jesse Wharton, who will become the manager of the gardens, is suggesting, there's bad behavior going on up there. We don't want people to be drunk. We don't want people to be fighting. This needs to be child-friendly. It needs to be family-friendly. And there are also some pieces that appear in the standard that really surprised me that talk about air quality, green space, and again, this idea that there are children in Butte who need somewhere to play. I think it is worth digging in further, which I plan to do on sort of why are we using children to leverage the idea that we have this public need, which is not to say that we shouldn't, but just what are the motivations behind that. I do think that marks an important shift in how we think about Butte because it's so often talked about as a mining camp, and we think of a mining camp as a really male space, just full of men chewing tobacco, going underground, getting dirty, doing whatever they want. But by 1898, we are talking about this as a place with kids that needs to be a certain respectable, family-oriented place. Of course, the city fails. They can't raise the money, and it's a little sticky with the land being outside the actual city limits. And it just so happens that one senator, William Andrews Clark, really needs some good press because the same time that he buys the park in March 1899, he has just been seated in the Senate, but he is also immediately under investigation. So he doesn't look good. I can't say for certain if that's why he buys the park, but regardless, they're happening at the same time. This is also when he's building his mansion in New York City right by Central Park, and I think that's important because it gives him something to base his ideas of Columbia Gardens off of. And it can be really frustrating doing the kind of history that I do, which is very cultural and social based, because when we talk about the late 19th century, we're most often reading about New York and Chicago, and sometimes San Francisco. And while I love those cities, that's not the experience of most of us in the United States, especially those of us from Montana. Maybe we travel, but a lot of us our families have been here for a couple generations, and we're perfectly happy here, but that doesn't mean that what's going on in our cities and in our local history isn't just as important as what's going on in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago. So Clark takes on the gardens and really tries to make it a world-class facility and really does promote it as his gift to the city. There are some legends around whether or not he actually meant to leave the park to the city upon his death, we don't have any documented intention of actually doing that. It does seem like it was just listed among his portfolio of properties that was going to his estate. But there was still this idea that this was really meant for the city, and it was very much meant for children. And that's one thing where I know Clark gets a bad rap for being cold-hearted capitalist, which I don't necessarily disagree with. He was really invested in making investments. But children really mattered to him in large part because of the death of his son, Paul. So Paul Clark died at the age of 16. He was sick, and that's when Clark made the Paul Clark Home for Children, which is now the Ronald McDonald House. And so there is, I think, an important motivation that Clark has to give to the community, and especially to care for its children. And that is deeply tied for him emotionally to why he has Columbia Gardens and why the city needs it, and particularly why Children's Day existed, so that kids could come up for free and enjoy the idea of picking flowers and picnicking together. It's just another image I like. It's very pretty, but it is particularly green is another reason that I like it, is thinking about, Clark advertised the gardens as well as quite literally an emerald gem, and that it was outside of the city. And so it's wonderful that Butte had this place again, but when I bring you back to that slide I showed earlier of this is a huge contrast to what's going on in the neighborhoods and streets of this town that we love. And so that's start of where my project started to change into thinking, well, Columbia Gardens isn't open in the winter at all. So what are people doing? I mean, the kids are still here, and that's where a lot of ice skating and school playgrounds come in. But I started to look through the city council records related to parks and playgrounds, and that's when I started to find that Clark actually wasn't the only mining figure providing an area for recreation for people in the city. So as early as 1916, we have a proposal that's presented to the city council where the Anaconda Company says that they might offer the use of surface lots for some of their claims to give to the park for an undetermined amount, or give to the city for an undetermined amount of time to use as public parks, as public space. And I don't know that the city actually accepts this offer until 1919, but they do. They do choose to sort of take these on loan with no financial stake, but to build parks on top of mine yards. I think this is both fabulous and preposterous in a number of ways. It is great that the city is able to take advantage of this and to start thinking of providing a real park system, even if it's not formalized for a long time. It also makes sense that if you have land that's not being used, that it be used for something. It's great that the Anaconda Company is trying to give back to the community. They're also keeping that claim underground. When we go back to that patchwork quilt of what does it mean to have a claim. I mean, if they decide to change their mind and mine what's underneath, they can. They don't give up the mineral rights. And I don't think that means that it's not a generous offer, but I do think it's something to keep in mind about what's going on when we talk about motivation and why people are doing something like this. It's also a bit preposterous when you come up upon what exactly these spaces were. I mean, this is a tailings dump, and that's what becomes Chester Steel. Or even, this is from a 1904 map, and we just see a lot of smoke in the air floating right over this lot that's going to become a park. It also presents problems today, right? So this is the Silver King. This was actually from the Davis Daily Corporation, not from Anaconda Company. But again, the Silver King mine, that surface becomes a park. But then this is 2019 where they had to excavate the collapsed mine. And I don't know that anything actually bad happened to anyone because of this. And for the most part, I think folks are pretty on top of this in Butte. But when you tell somebody outside of this community or outside of Montana that a park is an old mine yard or an old dump, that's quite a thing to consider, especially when we're talking about children and health and environment, when we're worried about things like lead or arsenic, and it presents a number of challenges. So this effort continues in the teens and the 20s of using these surface lots, and then that's when we start to enter a new era, which is this federal era of maintaining a park system. And so I've taken a couple excerpts from Works Progress Administration documents that I've looked at here at the archive. And I pulled these quotes specifically because, again, I'm thinking about the motivations for why do we have certain parks when we have them. And it's really interesting to see a federal idea coming into Butte to talk about what's the role of a park in a community and how is recreation healthy, whether that's healthy for the mind or the body. But saying that people really should have leisure time, that this is a service that should be provided to the community, and especially the idea of delinquency. This is something that we see well into the Nixon administration, actually, about the idea that you need to occupy kids' time so that they're not fooling around doing things they shouldn't do. So this was a general project number 13, for pretty much all the parks in Butte. Project number 18 was specific to Thompson Park, which is a very unique space because it is city park, but it's managed by the Forest Service, and you know, there's an inn out there that gets rented out, but this is a campground right outside of the city. And again, the idea here, I pulled this one out because it talks about natural facilities. And so even though I'm not trying to impose any idea of the environmental movement of the 60s onto the past, because it's not in people's minds. That's not a part of the motivation. But that's not to say that people don't have ideas about what nature is and what our relationship is to it as people. I mean, we could, again, annoying historian thing of going back even further is you can go back to the Transcendentalists, you can go to Thoreau and the 1830s and thinking about what is American nature and how do we spend time in it. And again, I bring up all these sort of outside things because this is a federal idea coming into Butte to shape our local community. So then in the 1960s, and I realize I'm kind of speeding through, I don't want to bore you guys forever, but the second federal program I will talk about is the Model Cities program, which comes through Housing and Urban Development. And this was important for updating a lot of those WPA improvements. And again, I'm thinking about what is the federal government bringing into Butte to think about what our city should look like. And in this particular proposal from 1967, there's a lot of discussion about how Butte has sort of deteriorated since the height of its underground mining era. So this is very solidly in the open pit mining era, which is something that I always try to keep in mind of when I'm thinking about the contrast between mining and parks. We're talking about a very different set of contrasts from underground mining to parks as opposed to open pit mining and parks. If you guys have read Brian Leach's The City That Ate Itself, I think he does a really good job talking about what that sort of does to people when they're thinking about work and like the independence of being an underground miner as opposed to being supervised as a driver in the pit. But it also physically changes what Butte looks like. And so that means it also sort of changes, you know, if you can see the pit from a park, that's really different. I'm really struck when I go over to the Copper Mountain Recreation Complex that, you know, you're in this beautiful new park on a lovely trail and you're overlooking the cemeteries and you see the pit and you see Lady of the Rockies, and it's just such an evocative like layering of history that you can experience even now. Yeah, I'm not going to read that out loud. I'm going to just go ahead and skip to the historic preservation and cleanup era. So of course the pit shuts down, fills up, and so much of Butte has been, at least in the eye outside of Butte, defined by the idea that it's a Superfund site. And I bring up the Superfund era because I have to, but also because the historic preservation era, I think very specifically comes out of the Superfund era because of what is threatened. When spaces start to get cleaned up is when people say, wait a second, that's our history. So in particular, the mine yards. I think Anselmo is one of the first ones to really get cleaned up and turned into a historic and public space like we're familiar with it now, of saying, we know this needs to get cleaned up, but we don't want to lose the history. You know, and I think this is an important moment to consider because history is based on contingencies. It's not inevitable in any way. And if the people of Butte hadn't fought for this, if the people of Butte hadn't wanted to preserve their history, you might not have any head frames left now. And Butte would be a very different city to us now if we didn't have that anymore. And I don't say that to be depressing, but just to remind us that like our involvement in the community really matters, and that if we think of history as being passive, we're missing out on a lot of what our impact is in the world and why our communities look the way that they do. So I'm really interested in this 1985 historic park system plan, in part just because, like I said, I walk around Butte a lot and I love the Copper Mountain, or the, oops, wrong way. I love this trail system, the Copperway Trail System. I think it's fantastic that you get to walk from mine yard to mine yard and absorb history as you go if you want to on the placards that are around. And of course there's a picture from Foreman Park up by the mountain con. So I don't have a lot of conclusions about the actual intricacies of this program yet because I'm still going through it, but I did just want to mark it as an important chapter in this era of cleaning up, and that they're happening at the same time as this, right? And I think it is significant, not only to the community, but particularly to my project when this came out in 2020, the cleanup decision, that right on the front they're emphasizing that this space is going to be green, and it's going to be healthy, and it's going to be usable. And that's, that's the long story of parks and how we're using land and space in Butte. So I'll finish up with just a few examples that have really struck me as interesting. So I did bring up the Copper Mountain Recreation Complex. In the 90s, I think this was called the Timber Butte Park Project, but knowing that it was formerly a concentrator and tailings area, that there was a dump here, and it's been turned into a wonderful park complex. And so in some ways, I guess there is some historical erasure here, but I mean, it's sort of already come and gone as far as the Clark tailings are concerned. And I do think there is a lot of interesting overlap that comes in here, not quite with the Copper King era necessarily, but just noting that this project also was completed with a lot of help from Montana Resources. I know a lot of money came in for that. And I think part of that is thinking historically about how do we raise money for parks, because as I talked with Jim about, everybody wants parks. Everybody wants a park in their neighborhood. But they're hard to maintain, they're hard to pay for. And how do we continue to do that and make a space attractive and livable? And then I just threw up a picture here of Stodden Park, which again is a gorgeous space that Butte has. Again, we have funding from Dennis and Phyllis Washington and Montana Resources. I also particularly love this park because of the way it has incorporated history and the identity of Butte. So the head frame slides and the dump truck play area, and of course the Spirit of Columbia Gardens carousel, and the way that people have been able to preserve certain ideas about Butte's past and its identity that continue today. I also concluded these because it's a really big shift to think about parks making a place livable as opposed to jobs necessarily. And that's not to say that Butte isn't trying to attract people for jobs, but I know Montana itself was talked about a lot in the last 3 years for Zoom towns, right? And in our Montana way, we like to talk about Californians moving in with their out-of-state jobs, and they don't have to contribute to the community. They can live here cheaper than they can for California, but they make it harder for the rest of us. But it is true now that work isn't necessarily beholden to where you live. Whereas if you wanted to get in on the copper mines, you had to come to Butte. And so I'm just trying to tell that very long story of how it's changed, that Butte was a place to come for work, and that we're trying to attract people to a healthy, beautiful place to live, while also coexisting with this past that is grand and wonderful and terrible and exciting in how we move forward. So I'm just going to skip over all of that and call it a presentation. I would love to speak with anyone who wants to do an oral history with me. I've had a couple of folks here already participate. I hope I don't bite. I'm mostly okay. I love to talk to people. So we just sit down with a recorder and some microphones and talk about Butte parks, mining, cleanup, and the environment. Not necessarily a 1960s idea of environment, but just what does it actually look like and feel like to live here, and try to be healthy. So I'm going to end there, and I'm really both terrified and excited for your questions, because everybody in Butte knows more about Butte than I do. But all the same, I thank you for being here today and for listening to me babble. And let's have a little discussion.
Very good.